People who have spent time in a psych ward. What is the craziest thing you've witnessed? Story 1. A girl grabbed my toe while I was sleeping. I woke up and said, "What the fuck?" and she ran off. I went to the front desk to complain, and while I'm talking to the lady, the girl jumped on my back and clung like a monkey while screaming. It was bizarre. I threw her off me and the lady just said, "Sorry about that, lol." Story 2. I was in an adolescent inpatient facility for 30 days. Two people come to mind. One kid named David, who was very tall for his age. I think he was only 13. He insisted on watching Friday the 13th movies on movie nights, and everyone was afraid to disagree with him because of his violent nature and frequent homicidal fantasies. He hated taking his meds, and probably 2 or 3 times a week he'd brawl with the psych nurses over it. No joke, it took 5 to 6 large grown men to overcome this kid. He was scary. The other one was just sad, a girl named Wendy. She was 13, really nice. But she always wore the same clothes and she stank really bad. Apparently this is a common defense for kids who have been repeatedly raped/assaulted by family. They don't clean themselves, or they'll even soil themselves to make themselves undesirable to their abuser. I gave her a big hug every night in the common area when it was time to go to our cells. Story 3. The funniest thing I ever saw. Spent total of about 3 years in my teens and early 20s. A kid in seclusion who was having a genuinely good time making staff's life a living nightmare while he was in there, took apart the plastic mattress, tore the foam inside into small pieces, donned the empty mattress and started yelling, "I'm Gumby, damn it," while tossing the pieces of foam around like confetti. Even most of the staff were laughing about it. Story 4. Not a patient but an employee. Seen countless patients attacked by other patients. Many serious injuries, and a couple that came close to death. Some of the patients' backstories can be wild. Some are almost unbelievably tragic, some are legit criminal. Some of the most foul and disgusting personal hygiene I've ever witnessed. Worst was a patient who had no concept of using a restroom. They would simply shit or piss themselves wherever they were sitting or standing. Was real fun when they decided to do it during mealtime. I think the most shocking thing though, is how you can have some truly awful and psychotic patients who turn out to be genuinely cool people once you get them on consistent meds. I'm talking 100% turnarounds. Of course then they get discharged, stop taking their meds, and the cycle repeats. Story 5. When I was 19 and admitted the first time. I was anxious already, and could barely sleep the first night. My roommate was quiet, which didn't alarm me at first. The next day I went to the common room, and talked to some people, and then later went back to my room, and found that my roommate had scribbled, "Find them," all over the walls, and was talking to herself. I was terrified and grabbed a nurse who tried to talk to her, but couldn't make any sense out of what she said, and I asked to stay in another room. I stayed in the restraint room that night by myself, and woke up the next morning to a fight in the hallway, and nurses running past my room. Apparently one guy pulled out his dick in front of the wrong patient, and got punched. Then later that week, I was cornered by the same guy who pulled out his dick, and asked if I wanted to have sex in the bathroom. I literally cried after that and was fucking terrified, so I would say my whole first trip there. Story 6. I saw a schizophrenic woman break into the room of a man with catatonia. She gave him a BJ and apparently it was enough to get him out of his psychosis. Edit, spelling mistake. Story 7. I've worked in one for about 2 years now. The staff are just as crazy. Here's some highlights. Patient got into the ceiling, couldn't get them down for a while. Patient milked themselves into their coffee. Did you know some antipsychotics make you lactate? The entire adolescent unit escaping because maintenance forgot to lock the gate. Don't worry, they all came back eventually. And myself getting a concussion from a patient trying to escape. They weren't successful, but at least I didn't work for 6 weeks. Story 8. Another story is not as crazy as it is heartbreaking. But in my time working I've seen my fair share of suicidal ideations, patients, but only once have I seen someone who had completely in every possible sense of the phrase given up, unlike anyone else I've come across. He was 60 plus and had spent his whole life homeless and in and out of institutions, living with his brother and his brother's family periodically until the patient became too much to burden for the family. I spent every shift with him on a one-to-one, order to have eyes on the patient 24/7, as every chance he could get he would self-harm with whatever he could find. I'm only a technician, so I don't have a degree of any sort other than a high school diploma. I still would listen to him talk for the hours I spent with him, the most nihilistic and pessimistic tangents I've ever heard, a sense of hopelessness and despair I've never considered possible. Even the mountain of medications he was given seemed to have little effect. And then, as his hold ended, he was discharged. I'm not a doctor or certified in any way as I stated before, but I can't believe he was given the okay to be released. This event sticks with me because I was left without any answers or explanation of what happened. The next day his room was occupied by a new patient. Story 9. Not a psych ward, but an inmate at a jail I spent some time as a trustee at who was very mentally ill. Dude had apparently been arrested after being drunk for the better part of the last month straight, and was withdrawing hard as well as obviously not being all there mentally. He was in his own isolation cell, and everyone had heard him screaming all sorts of perverse, insane, and nonsensical shit since he was put in there. A while after dark, we got called over to do a cleanup of his cell, and what I saw in there was like something out of a horror movie. Blood on every surface, as well as just about every other bodily fluid one can imagine, as well as shit. Even on the fucking ceiling, and that must have been a feat to accomplish. Parts of his scalp had been pulled off and stuck to the mirror over the sink, which contained a mixture of the aforementioned bodily fluids and was no longer draining as a result. To top it off, he had pulled out many of his own teeth, which were scattered just about everywhere. I didn't vomit, but I certainly would have if I had stayed around. I just noped out and told them to get someone else to handle that. Easily one of the most disturbing things I've ever witnessed in person, and really showed me a different side of mental illness I'm not sure I'm glad to know exists. Story 10. I was a social worker at an institution that had a hall for what we called lifers. It was essentially for people who had no hopes of ever being released due to their conditions. Anyway, my hall had 14 beds and it was full. There was this one guy who was huge. He was 6 feet 7 inches and about 350. His name was Simon. He suffered from drug-induced schizophrenia and had bipolar disorder. He talked to himself all day, but never talked to others. All the other men in the ward were scared of him. It was my day to do first shift. I got there early to start on some paperwork I needed to finish. When I got my keys in the door, I heard Simon hit the door with his fists. I looked through the tiny window on the door and he and the hall was covered in blood. I panicked and called security for backup because I thought he had killed somebody. Turns out, Simon was in the throes of an extreme manic episode and had managed to walk the literal soles of his feet off. Other medication he was on thinned his blood and led to him bleeding all over the place. We checked the camera footage and he had walked and talked all night. The orderly, who was fired that day, had slept through his whole shift and never heard Simon walking back and forth. Story 11. Another patient, in a good mood, asked me to kick him in the balls. I did not. I was drugged-like and regarded as a schizophrenic for over a year only to later have the diagnosis and medication dropped. Legal systems are fucked up and corrupt. Story 12. I work in EMS and volunteered in a PYSCH ward briefly, so my experience is always a bit superficial, but the craziest part for me is how a lot of patients oftentimes act completely normal and rational. I've transported a lot of people to a psych ward that were diagnosed with all sorts of illnesses, but from my interaction with them they were completely normal and just had some general anxiety. A lot of people I've observed and wondered, why the hell are they even here? Story 13. Had a rough time my first year at college. Almost unalived myself and got put in psyche for a week. The ward was a chaotic mix of Alzheimer patients, detoxing addicts, and us mental health folk. There was a separate unit for the older folks, but it was overcrowded my first night there. So I, a dissociative mess coming off of sedatives, had a mumbling old woman for a roommate. She kept calling me her daughter's name. Was flopping around in her bed. Coming up to me and getting in my face. Begging for me to help her escape. I told the nurses, but they didn't care. I was able to go in and out of sleep briefly and woke up to a horrid smell. Somehow she managed to squat over a cup and take a shit in it. When I saw her and realized what was happening, I bolted from the room, and finally an attendant took me seriously. She was relocated to the ward, and luckily my new roommate was a regular old depressed suicidal person just like me for the rest of my stay. I could go on and on about the neglect and abuse from the staff, but that by far was the most extreme experience I had. Story 14. I used to work in a psych ward about 22 years ago in a private locked unit. I would say autistic kids shitting in the drawers and someone eating a light bulb would be two of the worst. Story 15. Not super crazy. Just odd. Was with a bunch of teens on a pediatric ward, but we all had special rooms by the nurse's desk with shatterproof, wired glass so the nurses could always look in on us easily, and the bathrooms had no locks. Myself and another girl were in for anorexia. Another guy was suicidal to the point where he couldn't have any cutlery but a plastic spoon for meals, no blankets, special pajamas, etc. And then there was a young homeless guy who'd been hit by a car while squeegeeing for change, so his leg was in a full cast, yet he still had a habit of sneaking around, in his wheelchair, and hoarding extra supplies from the kitchen, the kids' playroom, the nurse's station, etc., so they kept him in one of the psych rooms. We formed a weird little club, and would often play cards in a lounge area together. Conversations would go something like this: me, hey, does anyone want this cheese? I snuck it into my pocket so nurse thought I ate it. Homeless kid, mine. Dibs. Here, you can have these beads I swiped from Craft Time. Other anorexic, I'll get you some ice cream and saltines if you find me some sewing gear. I'm gonna sew some batteries into my hair scrunchie for my next weigh-in day. Suicidal kid, do you think I'd die if could scoop my eyeball out with a spoon? And so on. It was a very bizarro time in my life. Story 16. A doctor told me I was too fat to be in there and should come back when I actually look anorexic. I was already pretty underweight, and I was released hours after that. Story 17. Man, when I was like 16 to 17 I was forced into one for reasons. There were 16 of us including me. Thank God, because we had to have roommates and the nurses tell you nothing about the person moving in your room. This is bad because they lock all the doors every night at a certain time like jail. But I was number 16. Odd numbers are amazing, so I had no roommate till someone else came along. There was one kid who would act totally normal most of the time, then just freak out for no real reason. Then the very large men nurses would hold him down. As the doctor would inject him with what we called booty juice, cause it goes in your ass cheek as they hold you down. You pass out in like 10 seconds, then they drag you to your room where you wake up 3 to 5 hours later and everybody acts like nothing happened. He wasn't the only one to get it. We were all scared. They would all be like, don't do that or you get booty juice. But this kid got it almost every day. So to the real story, there was one night where I guess he snapped in the middle of the night. This was a large kid for his age. He looked like a middle linebacker from the NFL, and this was a younger than 18 only place. So he decided to beat the crap out of his roommate one night in the pitch black. All I could hear was this kid screaming for his life. Then he broke down his door. This is a large wood door with metal interior like a front door of your house. But he ripped through it like the Hulk after he was done with his roommate. Then was trying other doors I guess to find another person, and he was beating on doors and screaming like a maniac. Maybe that's why he was there, but damn, that was the longest. Well, felt like hours but only lasted 20 to 30 minutes. Hoping my door was solid enough or he wouldn't try my door till the nurses gave him the booty juice. The next morning everything was normal. We played basketball, watched TV, and everyone acted normal. He was chatting my ear off about who knows what. I was in my head thinking, yeah okay, whatever you say, just don't kill me. I was only there a week, and damn, that's not the only story. That shit is life-changing, and not in a good way. Story 18. As an intern in college, I had a woman pull my hair, making my head go down to my waist. A woman asked me to wash her vagina. I saw a man holding his hand up saluting for like 6 days. A man tried to sneak out but got caught in between security door 1 and 2. Story 19. My mother worked in an asylum in Ireland when she was about 15. This was in the early 60s. She loved working there, despite the fact that some of the patients would physically try and kill her. One patient always stuck out to her. Every day he would tell my mom he was going to kill her when she finished work. She knew he loved music, so would tell him she was out dancing that night, and could he wait until the next day, which he agreed to. The next day he would forget what he had said, and would threaten her again, and she'd say the same thing again. This went on for a couple of years that she worked there. Story 20. I saw a patient try to escape by crawling through the ceiling tiles. Story 21. Most amazing, for some reason a piano was in the psych ward. A patient who never spoke started playing. She knew every piece by heart. The entire ward of psychotics, manics, and even staff went and sat in that room. Not a word was spoken for a good half hour. Craziest, family members choking a patient because his sister gave another patient a blow job. A guy who thought he was Jesus convincing the entire ward to meet on the balcony to discuss ways of breaking out. A guy would run away every day, steal a car and drive back to the ward. People speaking in tongues, scary. Story 22. I've worked in a ward for about 6 months now and have seen pretty much everything, but the one event that sticks with me the most is catching a girl trying to dig out the inside of her vagina with her fingernails. Blood was everywhere. Just remembering the event makes me cringe. Story 23. Not much in particular. I just kinda had a bit of imposter syndrome because I saw people zoinked out of their minds from schizophrenia or bipolar meds or whatnot, and there I was just kinda like, I'm sad and wanna die sometimes. The craziest thing was how hard they tried to shove religion down our throats, seemed almost criminal tbh. Story 24. Dad was an army medic doing volunteer duty at a state hospital. One particularly dangerous patient was known for being creative with violence. Apparently, he got his hands on a bristle from some kind of broom and sharpened it into a tiny skewer. He called in a nurse for something and flicked the skewer through her eye before anyone even realized. Blinded her instantly. I believe he got disappeared after that incident. Story 25. Guy hoarding bananas underneath his bed. Poor bloke, hope he's doing alright these days, but the bananas just seemed so odd. Story 26. I had a patient remove his eye with a spork. Story 27. Oddly enough, nothing, but at the one I was at we were kept separate from the more dangerous people. Story 28. It was a temporary thing for an incident I don't care to explain right now, but in the psych ward there was this kid, like, an actual kid. And he would always cry really loud late at night. During the day he started touching himself inappropriately and screaming his father's name. I guess he was at ped for days straight and it messed up this kid's head. I wish I could see how that kid is doing now, God bless his poor soul. Story 29. Not a patient but an employee. Had a 16-year-old kid come in who was about 6 feet 2 inches 220 pounds. Built like a linebacker. I found out since he was technically a child he somehow ended up at an autism school for children with very little security. He ended up inflicting a TBI on one of the teachers and got sent to us. The kid had a violent streak, the likes I hadn't seen before. He knew he was stronger than most and liked to fight unprovoked, and it always took 4 to 6 people to restrain him. I never seen a patient spend more time than him in the safety room, an incredibly small padded room with nothing in it. His parents wouldn't authorize his move somewhere else, and they wouldn't take him home either. We were not equipped for someone with his level of violence. So there he Saturday. For 1.5 years. It wasn't like a single incident that was crazy, it was the entire situation. Story 30. Every single person in a room agreeing on the quality of a show. We all hated Hamtaro, but it was all they'd let us watch. Story 31. Was a patient at a psych ward outside of Nashville, USA, saw this woman get body slammed by orderlies. They knocked her teeth out. There was also this 65-year-old man who walked around with a raging erection literally all day. Breakfast, lunch and dinner, this man was hard as a rock. It was both weird and disgusting. Story 32. 1. A woman I shared a room with demanded to be discharged. It was a voluntary admission, so her doctor discharged her on condition that someone else pick her up and take responsibility for her. Her ex-husband came and signed the discharge paperwork. Then they handed him all of her medications. He proceeded to give her the meds to pack it in her bag and left the room while she was packing. No one else was in the room with her at the time, and she proceeded to drink most of the pills she had. A nurse found her drinking the pills and got the other nurses to help restrain her while they waited for the paramedics. The paramedics loaded her up and took her to the government hospital. I hope she's okay and doing better now. 2. There was a guy who was completely narcissistic and managed to piss off all of the other patients by insisting that people who have attempted suicide are weak and should just get on with it. He was also delusional, insisting that he was the CEO of a big company and better than everyone else. After that, everyone shunned him. 3. Many years ago I was a student nurse and had one patient that had frequent psychotic episodes with times of lucidity in between. During one of his psychotic episodes, he managed to rip out his 4-line, his catheter, and then threw his glass water carafe on the floor. Everything was sopping wet and there were glass shards all over the floor. I did manage to get him to sit in a chair while I cleaned up the floor and remade his bed with dry bedding. Then I tried to dress him in dry PJs. It was at that moment that a whole platoon of medical students came into the room with their professor to see another patient. This guy then decided that I was the sexiest thing alive and tried to kiss me wherever he could while I was trying to dress him. Instead of helping, the medical students just laughed their asses off. Eventually we had to restrain this guy because he was still in the midst of his psychotic episode. The next day I had to help the same guy wash up, but this time he was lucid. I'll never forget him apologizing for the previous day. I'll never forget what he said next: "I'm not nuts. I'm a fruitcake, really." And the first thing I thought was, dude, you're a nutty fruitcake. I didn't say it out loud though. Story 33. So basically psych wards are a place with worse control than fucking prison, which you put genuinely insane people in mixed with regular or suffering people and making everyone's life worse while acting like they're animals. Great shit. Story 34. Not a psych ward stay, but I have PTSD from a tragic accident, and on the first anniversary of that, I ended up in the psych pod of the emergency department because I was having an hours-long anxiety attack. They took all my clothes and made me wear a hospital gown and hospital socks and put me in a padded room with a hospital bed for hours. At one point, I asked to go to the bathroom and I was escorted there and had to leave the door cracked with an attendant outside. The bathroom had feces strewn all over it, and when I told the attendant, he just shrugged like he didn't give a shit. There were all sorts of other patients there and most seemed homeless. This was in a city. Anyway, my husband was finally let in to be with me, and he started getting agitated because no one was coming to talk to me or discharge me, and I had been just sitting there for about 12 hours. Finally, a couple of doctors came in, gave me a prescription for Xanax and some lists of therapists to call. The male doctor's name was Dr. Pepper, no joke. I was discharged that night, and the next morning I started calling some of the places on the list. The first couple of times, I called and said, "Hello, my name is, I was referred to your office by Dr. Pepper at the Psych unit at hospital." And they hung up on me. LOL. I assume they thought I was prank calling. Anyway, I learned my lesson and ride my anxiety attacks out at home now. Story 35. I visited the psych ward as a psychology student, part of a mandatory course, and spent a couple of days there practicing interviewing patients. My personal worst memories are the old man who was catatonic and who could have died without anyone noticing for I don't know how long. He looked dead all the time, and the lady who kept picking the worms she hallucinated off her skin. I can't imagine what it must be living like that, but it's heartbreaking to watch. I knew some of them had been violent, I knew the ward was locked for a good reason, but these two haunted me the most. Mental health matters. Please take it seriously. Story 36. I was in Timberlawn when I was 16. Got beat unconscious by staff and dragged into isolation and left there without medical help. Then tried to escape and got juiced a few times. Story 37. Guy had a tattoo carved into his neck. Apparently he took a pen in his fist and repeatedly carved it into his skin right on his neck. It looked very scratchy and was still red despite it apparently being pretty old. You know how really young kids grip a crayon in their fist and grind it against the paper really hard? If you made a fist with your left hand and put it below the left ear, that was exactly how he must have done it. Story 38. I was put in one because of a bunch of bullshit earlier this year. I remember this guy I really related to told a patient advocate that he was witnessing a guy fondling a female patient in front of him. Now, even though I didn't witness the whole thing, if it wasn't enough that I already related to the dude that was informing, the reaction of the other guy would have been enough. The guy who reacted to the informing reacted by head-butting this dude's glasses and yelling out how he was a snitch motherf***, and you could actually see veins sticking out on the head of the guy who was yelling. That's when I closed distance a bit. My fists were in balls, and if he swung on or hit the bespectacled guy in any way, I was going to fight on behalf of the guy who had glasses. Bespectacled guy could either fake not being in fear really well or he actually was telling the truth. The other dude was saying how he would beat his ass, to which he calmly said, "You could try." Saying a bit later that he was trained in martial arts. I really hope I would have gone through with fighting alongside bespectacled guy against the other dude, but I don't know if I would have. The one who yelled, "Snitch," was taken away to another unit. Story 39. Not craziest but weird, I was early 20s in a general psyche ward. There was this patient late 30s woman who would either go between awful trauma dumping in the worst mouth-breathing fashion to everyone about her dad being a pedo, and then accusing everyone else in the ward of being that pedo going right up to your face and accusing someone of being a rapist etc. She also treated nurses and techs as well as all the other patients as her servants and was offensively entitled. She'd constantly go in the secure outside area and sit and lay and immediately start yelling for someone to get her up, which she's capable of, yelling for people to bring her water, food, and her smokes. Would keep doing this until someone complied and she'd never do anything for herself and made other people do everything for her, went inside for 10 minutes to do the rounds of trauma dumping to random people, then calling them a pedo, and then going outside and pretending to be stuck somewhere again all day on constant repeat. Story 40. I saw a man smear his shit on the window of the room he was in with a dead-eyed stare. Never gonna forget that sight. Story 41. The screaming. The crying. You can hear the pain. Story 42. I work in a hospital that has a psychiatric unit and I am in the float pool, so I get sent to that unit occasionally. Few months ago I was there. A patient attacked one of the counselors, detached his eye from the socket and he is now blind on that side. Second craziest was someone eating their poop straight from the tap. Story 43. I was in one with people who were mostly in for suicidal ideation. One patient was a nice young girl who did not eat anything the entire week I was there. A few months later I was at the grocery store and she was working there but was getting fired by what looked like a horrible bully of a manager. Watching her walk to her car absolutely defeated broke my heart. I hope she is doing better now. Story 44. My brother-in-law had a stint in a psych ward a little over a year ago, and on a particularly manic day they were in the middle of the community room and started singing, "I have a structured settlement and I need cash now." This was then met by about 40 to 50 psych patients shouting back, "Call J.G. Wentworth. 877 CASHNOW. After getting a few verses in, the orderlies stepped in and kindly requested they stop, which was kinda a shame since it sounded like they were all having a good time. Thanks for tuning in to Peak Reddit. We hope you enjoyed hearing the latest and greatest stories from the most interesting corners of Reddit. If you loved what you saw and heard today, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the Peak Reddit community. You can check out more videos from us, you might like them. And if you have any amazing stories or experiences that you want to share with us, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a comment or shoot us a message and let us know what you think. We'll see you in the next video.